House Democrat Nima Kulkarni, who's practiced immigration law for over a decade, told us today she's disappointed the measure is a top priority of the Senate, given the weighty issues pressing state lawmakers this session. And she gives an opposing perspective on the rationale and tenets of the bill.
One of the main things is that this bill mandates essentially any public agency employee to do the best that they can in, I guess, determining who's an immigrant that's here without documentation, and then having the authority somehow without any training whatsoever to enforce immigration law. So this is going far beyond any kind of a sanctuary city policy. This is specifically mandating public agency employees, including law enforcement, to use their own best judgment and in their own discretion to physically detain sometimes, question, interrogate, and really single out individuals based on what? We don't know according to this bill, because there's no training implemented in it, there's no component, there's no funding for it. So it's essentially giving carte blanche and creating this environment where now even your neighbor can essentially turn you in for being an undocumented immigrant.
Do they have to provide some substantiated evidence, documentation to that effect?
So the only document that's mentioned in this bill is a driver's license, which not every citizen of the United States even has. So that is not an immigration document. That has no bearing on what immigration status an individual might have. And it's very deeply concerning that this is placed in a piece of legislation without any thought to the consequences of who may or may not have a driver's license, and who is the person asking for that document, and how are they possibly going to ascertain an immigration status based on this document, again, with no training whatsoever.
And so then the due process for the person that's being accused of being undocumented is what? And how laborious is that? And how would they go through the process of securing their place here for the time being or permanently?
Right. So this places the burden of detention, of basically detaining, arresting anybody on law enforcement agencies and jails. So the cost to the jails, and in terms of capacity, we already know that we're over capacity in a lot of Kentucky jails. The cost and the processing time and the administration of that, none of that is mentioned in here as a potential impact or consequence. All of those costs and all of those consequences will be borne in the localities where these individuals are kept and detained. Based on what? I don't know. There is no thought given to any due process considerations. One of the things that I had mentioned to some of my colleagues, and I know we had talked about it probably in one of my earlier appearances, is the first time I came to Frankfurt, when I moved back to Louisville in 2010, I was testifying against a bill very similar to this that had been implemented in Arizona and Alabama and Georgia at that time, basically dubbed the Show Me Your Papers bill. Mm-hmm. This was also model legislation, kind of like this bill is, that's basically copy-pasted, shopped around to different jurisdictions to see where it will stick. Now, we were going to implement that after Arizona's statutes and Alabama's statutes had already been struck down as unconstitutional, after they had paid millions upon millions in legal fees and court costs. And the laws didn't stand. They got rid of those laws, not only because of the legality and the cost to the state and to the local jurisdictions, but because they essentially lost an entire segment of their workforce, specifically in agriculture and manufacturing, which devastated their economy. So this is the same kind of bill 10 years later that I'm incredibly disappointed to see as the priority for our Senate, again, because we have so many real concerns facing Kentuckians during this budget session, which we're going to craft for the next 2 years. There is no funding. This is an unfunded mandate. It puts the burden and the liability on local jurisdictions. It tells your local law enforcement that what they should do with their money, what they should do with their labor, what they should do with their officers, without explaining how they're supposed to be trained or who's going to pay for that additional cost. For workforce reasons, for economic reasons, and for family separation reasons, because another consideration is what's going to happen if you detain a parent. What happens to the child that's at home? Who's taking care of the children? Because as you asked, the due process concerns of the individual are not considered in this bill. So they may be detained for X amount of time. There is no agreement with ICE, according to this bill. There's nothing in terms of when ICE needs to come pick them up. Nothing is specified in this bill. So what you've got is a definite lawsuit for violation of a person's due process and civil rights. Meanwhile, the children are where? If they don't have relatives, are they going into foster care? Are schools going to take care of the burden? I mean, it's none of that is specified in the bill. And I think it's dangerous, especially given some of the rhetoric that has been already surrounding this legislation and legislation like this in other states. I think what we need to look at is what is of concern to Kentuckians and not waste our time during this very, very important budget session on items that are basically talking points for some individuals who are in an election year.
Is there a legal definition for sanctuary cities? And there's some concern that there have been instances in California where those policies exist, that very violent criminals who were undocumented, those cities have harbored those criminals. Your response to that concern, and that this really addresses public safety, sanctuary, not allowing for sanctuary cities is a public safety issue and concern.
Right, and that's basically how this has been framed as well. There is no legal term for sanctuary city. The term sanctuary city and sanctuary jurisdiction generally arose during the 1980s when churches took it upon themselves to help individuals from Central America who were coming here as refugees, essentially trying to escape all the violence, the drug violence and civil war that were going on in those countries. So that's where the term sanctuary comes from, because it was originated in churches. There is no legal definition because it's not a legal term of art. It does not protect anybody. So it is dangerous to say something is a sanctuary jurisdiction, a place, because you cannot provide actual protection from federal immigration law. In terms of law enforcement, nothing is hindering law enforcement from doing their jobs in pursuing violent criminals or criminals in any capacity where their communities are being served. So nothing is hindering them. Sanctuary cities essentially are saying that we are not, what they're doing is saying that we are not entering into these there's two specific kinds of agreements that you enter into with ICE to essentially detain individuals for a set number of hours, 48 hours is the norm. And then also in terms of assisting local law enforcement, local law enforcement assisting ICE, they have to essentially be deputized as immigration officials. That's a very specific agreement. It's a 287G agreement. Those are the only two ways that a local law enforcement official can enforce federal immigration law. Without those agreements, it's not legal for local law enforcement to do that. So all that they're saying, these sanctuary jurisdictions, is that we do not have these agreements in place. So in terms of cooperation, there's nothing stopping local law enforcement from cooperating with ICE if ICE has a warrant for a person's detention, for a person's arrest. The issue arises in this bill and bills like it where you're mandating local jurisdictions that do not have these agreements to essentially flout federal law and go it alone, or to help ICE whenever in your own judgment. And that's not legal, it's not constitutional. It has resulted, as I mentioned, and we have data for the past 10 years since these types of bills have been introduced, basically saying that an individual's due process rights were violated. There were legal lawsuits. There were millions and millions of dollars wasted in terms of workforce and industry. So sanctuary city by itself doesn't mean anything in terms of protecting criminals. That is some of the rhetoric that is surrounding this, which is why we're seeing bills like this framed as a law enforcement issue, where in fact bills like this hinder law enforcement and mandate that local law enforcement use their finite resources in an area of law that they're not familiar with and are not authorized to enforce.
Representative Kulkarni says she's confident there are provisions in the bill that would be struck down in court and predicts immediate legal challenges if it passes. She also maintains that the legal liability costs stemming from the immigration measure would fall squarely on local jurisdictions.